So this is Penny Arcade 4 on the Rain-Slick Precipice of Darkness. So this is my world record video. I've muted it over. I'm kind of just going back over so I can do some commentary on it. So basically right now what's going on, this is the cutscene. It's 2 minutes long, so there's not really much to go over in this cutscene. Kind of just give a brief overview of the entire game. So basically the way this game works is that kind of like Mystic Quest, all of the enemies are visible on the map, so you'll be able to see all of the encounters before you get into them. Unlike Mystic Quest, however, once a battle has gone through, none will spawn, so even if you leave the area, no more encounters will occur. As well as that, all of the fights are scripted, so there's not going to be any random enemies in any battle. It's always going to be the same enemies in the same place. So the battles in this game are pretty straightforward. We know more or less, with a little bit of RNG included in them, we know more or less what abilities we want to use when. So all of the fights are very memorized, very muscle memory. There is a slight amount of RNG that can happen. There are some of the fights that go longer than normal. Some of the stronger enemies or some of the bosses, where if they hit the same character enough, that enemy or that character will actually get knocked out. That can affect how battles go a little bit. But besides that, there's not too much RNG in the game. There are a lot of characters we'll get throughout the course of the run. This, of course, is any percent. It differs slightly than the all characters run. Not by much, though. The first hour and a half or so are about the same. So this is where we finally kind of gain control. We skip a little bit of text here, and we're about to enter our first encounter. So right now we only have one character. This fight is pretty straightforward. 2 shots and you actually kill the enemy, so it's not too big a deal. It's kind of just going over the tutorials of this stuff here. Right now all we have is Leviathan. So some basic game mechanics here. So we have the trainers and we have the monsters. The trainers are who you see on the overworld. And the monsters are, of course, who we use in battle. So right now we have Leviathan and Mr. Beaks. Leviathan is currently linked to Dr. Blood, who is the character is the character who is following Gabe. Gabe is the one who is leading. He is linked to Mr. Beaks. This can be changed in the menu. You can choose who's linked to who. It doesn't matter too much for the course of this speed run. In casual, you would maybe want to consider doing that. But over the course of the run, we will run into 5 different trainers. You can only control 4 at a time. The game takes care of that for us. And we will run into upwards of, I believe, 15 or 16 different monsters. So you can link the monsters to more than one enemy. Again, in the speedrun, it doesn't really matter too much. You actually just go with what the game auto-assigns them. So over these past couple battles, there's not too much to go over. Gabe and Mr. Beaks are linked. Gabe gives Mr. Beaks a little bit of extra damage. Dr. Blood's linked to the Leviathan. As long as those two are linked, they get a little bit of extra damage. I haven't made too many mistakes here. I did a little bit of misplay, and I just had a little bit of movement error here, but first split's not going too bad. So now we're going to shift over to the other 2 characters. This is Jim and Moira. Again, we're still in the tutorial-esque phase, so this first fight we'll have Broden to Philosophy. This kind of shows... so Jim and Moira are the weaker set for the most part of the game. Not so much that Jim and Moira as trainers have bad abilities, just the monsters they have are pretty weak. They actually don't really make it much past the point when they join together and you have all 4 trainers and all the characters together. But for the most part of this game, they are split up. So Chapter 1, 3, 5, so on will be Gabe and Dr. Blood, 2, 4, and so on will be Jim and Moira. So this chapter here, we're actually running through a castle called Castle Tycho or something of the sorts. I can't remember off the top of my head, but most of the enemies in here will be Tychos. At the very end, we actually do run into Tycho. So Tycho plays a big part in the Penny Arcade series. In this, he's not a part of your party too much. You do get him for a little bit here and there, but for the most part, he actually isn't around. So we're about to get our first character that isn't given, or that isn't just default. So this here is the Dust Bunny, and he's actually the worst character in the game. And for the most part in this speedrun, he actually does hinder us more than he does good for us. He's pretty weak, as are most of the units that Jim and Mora have access to, but he is by far the weakest. Right now, we're just trying to get through here as quickly as possible. So, by holding down the B button, we can skip the battle animations very significantly. So this is actually at about 4 times the speed. There is a toggle run walk, which we toggle on once and then we're always on run, so that doesn't matter too much. But right here, we're just going through all the different moves. It's pretty straightforward. Philosophly has a spell that typically you use once you have 2 MP. Rodent has a attack that does magic damage. He also has an attack that'll add poison, and then Dust Bunny doesn't really do much. He does have a earth attack, but it's only really useful in this fight. So this next fight here is kind of the boss of the stage. It's not too bad as long as you handle it properly. Typically you want to poison the back one and get rid of the 2 front ones. It looks like so poison takes 2 mana, so we attack him the first round, poison him the second round. Philosophy and Dust Bunny take care of getting rid of the small ones. And then we're focused on just sunburning and dance crazying the goaler. And then Dust Bunny's just along for the ride. He only adds a little bit of damage here. It's not actually too relative. So now we're finished up here, and now this is one of the fights we get Tycho. This is actually a pretty easy fight because we have Tycho. Tycho's very strong, so we actually just have him one-shot everybody. Tycho, we don't see him again for a little while. We will get to be able to use him eventually down the road. But again, so there's just a bunch of dialogue between these two. Then we jump back to Gabe and Tycho. So now we're on a train here. The train's actually alive, and it's kind of taking us captive. So this here, this is kind of one of the fights that introduced the gimmicks of the game. So a lot of the fights in this game are gimmicky. So this one here has special battle condition that nobody can die on the enemy side if all the others in the fight don't have 1 HP. So we use a combination of bleed and auto attacks to make the first 2 go down to 1, and then we kill the third one. The third one is a one-shot from Mr. Beak, so it's fine. And so here is Gomez. If you've played any of the Zeboid games, you might have noticed him from some earlier games, but he's going to be the 3rd character we actually acquire. So Gomez is actually a pretty strong character. He has a very strong move called Suffocate, which will do the water damage. And if it actually kills the unit it's attacking, then you'll refund the mana. So it's very, very good if you can manipulate the hells of the enemies. Fortunately, we can do that, and we do that for the most part of the run, once we do get the ability. So right here, we've kind of run into where Mr. Beak starts really doing damage. Because he's linked to Gabe, he has a move called Power Up, which makes his next attack deal double damage. And then he also has an ability which takes 2 MP called Dive Bomb, which does a little bit of damage to himself, but it does a lot of damage. So we use this combination a lot throughout the game to deal a lot of damage really quickly. It's a very strong move. So here we see Gomez. It's actually called Smother right now. It turns into Suffocate a little bit later. But it's a very strong move. He just used it here. And again, right now we're just kind of staggering the enemies so we can, or the damage on the enemies so we're able to kill them quickly. This fight here is kind of long. You use a combination of Smother, Dive Beak, and Leviathan to get rid of him here. This split is pretty short. There's not too many fights here. It's not as short as the first one, of course, but we're almost at the end here. we're actually coming up on the fourth character that these guys are going to get, which is Vendor. So Vendor is a vending machine. His abilities are nice, but they're not as effective as you would like in a speedrun. So basically, per fight, we have items. Now, the items we have are based on the upgrades that we find or purchase, but we have a certain amount of items per battle, and they regenerate at the end of every battle. Vendors, at the cost of MP, lets you use an item without a cost. So only he can do it, but if he were to use a potion through his ability, it would cost him a mana, but it wouldn't actually use an item that all the others have. So it's a nice ability in theory, but the use in a speedrun isn't that great. That being said, he is a pretty good character. He has a pretty good he has pretty good stats, and he is a tank. He is linked to Gabe, so he does have attacks that do a little bit more damage there. So we're coming up on the third boss of the game here. Or I guess the second, really. Or the first, rather. The other two are considered... Or the other one's considered a boss, but it's not really a boss. This is the first boss here. So what we want to do is we want to get rid of the two Coalsmans first. And then we want to just unload on the Soul Furnace with everything we've got. So if I've done this correctly here, Gomez should be able to smother him. Yep. So he smothers him, and then he gets the mana refunded, so he'll be able to smother the Soul Furnace right after as well. I lied, actually, I did it wrong. Yeah, so I am losing a little bit of time on this split. If I had smothered correctly, I wouldn't have lost so much time, but I do lose a little bit of time here. So again, like I said, we're going right back to Jim and Moira here. So we're actually about to run into two pretty interesting characters. We're going to do a little bit of shopping first just to equip everybody with what we want here. And we are going to pick up some stuff for the characters that we are going to run into in just a second here. So basically, if we pick these items up, it makes the fights that we're going to run into a lot quicker. So the two characters that we're about to run into are Catsby and Twisp. So again, these are two very iconical characters in the Penny Arcade series. These two are very strong. Twisp is a physical damage dealer. Catsby is a magic user. Catsby actually will start off with 1 mana more than everybody else, as well as being very, very strong. He has a lot of AoE spells, and he's primarily ice-based. So these units here are also weak to ice. He doesn't have his Blizzard yet, which is the AoE, but he does have Ice Shard, which will get rid of them pretty quickly. A little later on, we'll run into 6 of these Wormlets, and he'll be able to one-shot them. They also do have an ability linked, so when they're being used in unison in the same party, they both buff each other up, so they deal more damage as well. So Moira and Jim here are linked to Twisp and Catsby, respectively. So Twisp actually does a lot of damage here. Twisp and Catsby have already exceeded Philosopher and Rodent in usefulness. Now we're running up into another fight here. So again, like I said, all of these fights, or most of these fights here, have gimmicks. This one here, you start off with a certain amount of MP, and you go down per turn. So the faster this battle gets done with, not only the better for time in terms of the speed run, but also the easier it is. One battle mechanic I forgot to mention up until this point is that every round that the battle occurs, the enemies actually get 10% stronger. Which is why bosses or units with big health are scarier, because they start off pretty weak, but again, 10% per turn. The longer that battle goes on, the harder the battle is. The defensive stats stay the same, but their offensive stats are what change. So this fight here, this is our Team Rocket impersonation. So we'll run into these guys a couple of times throughout the run. They're pretty strong here, mostly because we're pretty weak. The later fights, they'll be really easy to run over. But right now, Twisp and Catsby haven't had enough time to power up. And again, Philosophy and Rodent, very, very weak. This party is by far the weakest party of the game. Fortunately, we do see a lot more gameplay on Dr. Blood and Gabe's side. Excuse me. So we're employing a strategy here. Basically, everybody will auto when they don't need to. Defending doesn't do as much as we'd like right now in the game, but everybody's auto-attacking when they don't have an ability to use, and then they're using an ability when they can. Pretty straightforward. There's not really any mana manipulation here. This turn here, everybody just waits because Catsby can one-shot everybody. And then we're coming up into the second boss of the game. So he's weak to ice, which is nice, again, because we have Catsby. So basically what we're going to do is we're going to throw poison on him turn 2. Turn 1, again, we don't have the mana to do it. But turn 2, we're going to throw poison on him. And then everybody's just going to hit them with their attacks and then use their abilities when they can. So Twisp, again, does physical. So his attack, it does a lot of physical damage. Philosophize magic is wind-based. Twisp does have some fire-based moves, but he doesn't typically use them. And we've whittled this down here. So again, not too much of a hard fight. There's not really any chance of wiping here either. And then most of the time lost here is because of Soul Furnace. We actually should save a little bit of time here, yeah. So this fight here, the coming fights are going to be a little easy. They do get a little harder throughout this split, but they're not too bad. Right here, this is super straightforward. Everybody just attacks the first one, and then once everybody has 2 mana, Mr. Beaks can one-shot this guy while everybody else uses their spells in one shot. So we're going to be running up to a town here. So we're going to do a little bit of a shopping spree here. We're going to equip Mr. Beaks with some stuff. And I believe Gomez, and that should be it. And that's going to let us run through this next section really quickly. It's a really slow menu here. Oh, and I miss buying. Nice. So that was a terrible menu there. I'm not quite sure what happened, but I fumbled around a lot. So right there is a one frame dialogue, or not one frame dialogue. It's one text box that pops up. As long as you're mashing A, you can keep running through without losing any progress in your run. So I'm spamming A there just to run through it without having to stop for it. So everybody here, or most of the people in this area are weak to water, which is nice for Gomez. We are going to have an ability shortly for Leviathan, which is called Tidal Wave, which is going to be able to do some AoE damage. We're going to play around that a lot. So here's another gimmick. The Taskmaster is very strong because the other 2 are around. And we're going to run into another gimmick later, which makes it impossible for us to damage the top one without getting rid of the bottom 2. Or it's bottom 4, I believe, actually. Again, the fights are pretty straightforward. And this is one of the only times in the run where we will go off the intended path. The reason we're going off the intended path here is because there is an item for Leviathan, which makes him very strong in the magical department, which means that his tidal waves will actually be able to one-shot everybody we need him to. There are several fights where we'll be able to tidal wave and pretty much insta the entire enemy group. So this is why we're picking it up, because it actually makes all of the fights in this area so much easier. For the most part, though, straying off the intended path isn't faster in any way. So this fight here, the Blade Squirrel is pretty strong. We're going to get rid of the 2 slimes first, and then we're just going to wail on the Blade Squirrel. At this point in the game, we haven't really run into any hard fights. The hardest fights in the game are actually in the Yggdrasil castle, which is 2 splits from now. There are 3 fights in that castle, or that area, dungeon, whatever you'd like to call it, which are actually very, very possible that you wipe on them. And then the other hardest fight in the game is the final boss, which is the 4th. So this here is one of the fights I was talking about. I'm able to one-shot all of the team members with Leviathan's tidal wave, and then everybody just wails on the rock there. He's also not able to be damaged until Leviathan's wiped out the other 4, which is why I don't do anything for the first couple turns. But back to the hardest fights in the game. Again, there's not very many hard fights. The absolute hardest fight in the game isn't in the any percent run, it's only in the all categories run, and that fight is very scary, but we won't run into that here. So again, this fight here, I'm just stacking damage on one of them because Mr. Beaks can pretty much one-shot the other. Now, coming out of here is an enemy in the game that we don't get to showcase in the speedrun, of course, but it's my favorite enemy in the game. So that ladder right there is actually an enemy, and you get a pretty funny dialogue if you go towards it, and then it attacks you. That's one of the best parts about this game, is the comedy and the humor. Unfortunately, you don't get to see too much of it in a speedrun because, of course, just skipping everything. But it's stuff like that that makes me really like this game. So again, these guys are weak to water, so we're going to stack some tidal wave and smother on them. And then the bird eater at the back, we're going to use Mr. Beak to get rid of him. So we're about halfway through this split here. We're going to start to run into some oddball kind of characters here. It just kind of makes the upcoming fights a little more difficult, but again, it's not anything that's too hard. So if you notice here on Leviathan and Gomez, I've been using an ability called Energite. Basically what that does is it's a 0 mana ability that just gives us a mana. So we take a turn to get an extra 2 mana, essentially. We only really have it for this split, because we've only recently learned it. The only reason they have it is because they're linked to Dr. Blood currently. And actually at the end of this split, we're going to lose Dr. Blood, which is why we don't have it for the rest of the game. So Dr. Blood is about to be replaced by somebody called Hestia. She's important in the story, but in the speedrun it's completely irrelevant who they are. Dr. Blood is a character which was primarily used in the Penny Arcade on the Rainslick Precipice of Darkness series. He is in the comics, but he's not that big. Hestia was made up in this game to go with the Dr. Blood character. In terms of characters from the comic, from the comic strip, Leviathan is there with Dr. Blood in the strip. Mr. Beaks, in theory, isn't in the comic, but the character is based off something in the comic. Vendor is just a vending machine. As far as I'm aware, he hasn't been in a previous Suboid game. Gomez, however, has been in previous games by the developers. So this fight here is annoying because the one at the back can shield. So if he shields, you do almost no damage. So your focus is on hitting him when his shield's down. All of them have a lot of health, so the fight is pretty annoying. And right here, we're running up on another tidal wave fight. Everybody's going to wait. Leviathan's going to energite, and then he's just going to tidal wave and knock everybody out. It's a very easy fight here. And now we're coming up on the boss. So an interesting characteristic of Gomez is that he applies poison when he auto-attacks a unit. So I'm going to have Gomez auto-attack. My apologies, I forgot. I switched to a different strat here. So I'm actually not going to do that. Basically what I'm going to do here is I'm just going to pound on them with some Energite powered up abilities. So Gomez is going to use 2 Smothers and an Energite and then 2 Smothers again. Leviathan's just going to Energite, Dark Blood, Energite, Dark Blast. Mr. Beaks here is going to power up Dive Bomb every turn. And then I'm just going to use Soda Spray, which is a little bit of damage, or Cold One on Vendor, which is a potion. Based on what the fight, or how the fight is going. And then now on Leviathan, I'm switching to, instead of using Dark Blast, I use Tickle here because he's almost dead. So right here, we're actually going to lose Dr. Blood here, and then we're going to pick up Hestia. So we take control of Moira and Jim for all of 10 seconds to walk up to Gabe and Hestia. And then we're going to go right back to Gabe and Hestia. So an earthquake happens and we actually fall down. So now we're in this underground area. Now we have another interesting ability from Mr. Beaks. It's called Clutch a Call. So what Clutch a Call does is it calls in a very, very big giant crow to help us in the fight. We don't use it here, but we are going to use it in the upcoming fights. Right now, we're basically just wailing on them so that we can smother with Gomez and just knock everybody out as quickly as possible. I left Fuchsia in here by mistake. She comes with Hestia. We actually don't want to be using Fuchsia. It doesn't matter too much in that fight, but in the upcoming fights, we do want to have Vendor instead of Fuchsia. And it looks like, again, in this fight, I left Fuchsia in. It doesn't matter too much for the first couple of fights, because the damage Vendor would be doing is neglectable. Plus, we don't need a heal bot. But in the upcoming fights, it is very important that we switch to Vendor. Not only because his stats are better, but because he does have free healing, which can make the difference in some of the harder fights in the game. And here I actually remember to switch to Vendor. So the stalagmite in the back is resistant to physical, so basically what we're doing is we're just using spells and dive bomb because it's a wind-based attack to hurt it, and then we're clearing out everybody else. We're clearing everything else out with the others. So Leviathan actually dies here, but it doesn't actually matter too much here. So at this point I used Perforate on him. Actually is a little bit of a misplay. If I wanted to use it, I should have used it a little bit earlier. Basically what Perforate does is it reduces the defenses of a unit. And I actually go a little sloppy in this fight here because Leviathan died. Again, it typically doesn't happen, but in the swarm fights it is possible for somebody to go down. Typically doesn't matter too much. I did lose my composure a little bit there, but I didn't lose too much time. And so it actually looks here that I haven't been using the Clutch Claw. It seems I've been going to a different strategy here. Clutch a Claw and the other strategy don't waste too much time. Clutch a Claw saves time if you get the right RNG, but besides that, the other route is easier and faster to use, so it doesn't matter too much. So we're coming up on a little mini boss here. Again, not really a boss, but the enemy is a little stronger than the most in this area. Fortunately for us, they are weak to water. So this fight here, basically what I'm doing is I'm just autoing the first one, because then I'm able to use Smother and Dive Bomb to get rid of them. Like I said, they are weak to water here. So basically what's going to happen here is I need to target the boss here. It's going to spawn 2 more, and if I kill them before I kill the boss, then they respawn. So I'm going to focus all of my efforts on the back one. Again, she's weak to dark, water, and wind, so I'm able to get rid of her pretty quickly, and then I just one-shot the other 2. I used a tidal wave there and was able to actually get rid of pretty much all of them. One auto from the other 2 actually did it. So now we're going to get arguably the second or third most useful character in this run. It's a pair of glasses and a fake nose and a mustache. One of the strongest units in the game, has incredible magic damage. To fight him is actually pretty easy. Unfortunately, he doesn't have as much health as he does in the fight when we get him, but that's not a problem, because his magic damage is through the roof. So we're going to pick up a couple treasure chests here. Basically what we're doing is we're going to get enough money so that we can buy in the next castle. Once we do that, we'll have some pretty tricked up items. Basically, we'll be doing this instead of buying as much at the end game, and that's going to make the earlier splits a little easier and a little faster. And it's actually going to make the Griffometris a little easier to go through. So a lot of the enemies in this area are going to have a lot of health. Fortunately, we do have a lot of damage from amongst my party members. A lot of them are super effective to some units in here, so we're actually able to go through the fights pretty quickly. So at this point here, we've encountered 3 of the 4. Or, well, we've encountered all of the final units in the game, in the final fight. But once we collaborate with Moira and Jim, we'll be grouping up all of the units. We actually are going to be using Gratchapon, Mr. Beaks, and Gomez for the rest of the game, when possible. And then we're going to be carrying over 1 unit from the other, which is Twisp. This is pretty similar to the all characters run. In the all characters, though, we would switch out Twisp for a character we don't get in this run. So we're actually going to be coming up on... so I lied. When I was talking about hardest fights in the game, we're actually coming up on the hardest fight in the game right here. It's actually pretty easy to wipe out on this fight. It's very, very difficult. All of the attacks have to be correct, and the RNG just has to be perfect for you. So this right here is the Hypnotoad. Oh, that was a really hard fight. I'm really glad that I got it here, because it's a pretty hard fight. So the joke in this fight being that the win condition for that fight is you win. There's actually no fight with the Hypnotoad. You just win, and then you get the Hypnotoad as a character. The Hypnotoad does have some interesting abilities. He's meant to be a damage tank, so he pulls aggro on the units, and then he does damage based on damage he's taken. Not very strong in a speedrun, though, so we're going to keep Vendor as our tank/healer, because Vendor makes a nice heal bot. So these Lucky Kitties are an annoying fight, because if you don't kill them quickly, They all cast a AoE heal, so if you don't get rid of them quickly, then they start to heal for a lot of health. So what we do here is we get rid of the first and the second as quickly as possible. We're not actually going to be able to get rid of two of them before the first heals go off. So we focus on getting rid of the first one and dealing as much damage to the second one as possible. And then we just go hard on the third one, because they only actually get one heal off, or two heals off, one each. So we're picking up the second chest of the game. This is pretty much the only chest we're going to pick up, was the Whip Halberd from the Pillar Boss split, and these two money chests here. The two Darkness Hearts at the back are, of course, weak to wind, so Dive Bomb can one-shot them, which is actually called Skydive at this point. Throughout the game, as characters level up, sometimes their abilities just increase in strength and they gain different names. So Dive Bomb is now called Skydive. And so we're running up to the gimmick boss here. It's called the Tree of Demon Monkeys, and we're only allowed to bring one person into this fight. Fortunately, it auto gives you Gratchapon, and fortunately, Gratchapon has fire, which is weak to, and it usually gains 2 turns to every one of its, so it's a very fast fight. You could also switch out and bring Gratchapon, or not Gratchapon, Mr. Beaks out, but it's not usually worth it to do so. And by not usually, I mean you have to be very, very quick in your menuings and frame perfect to be able to make it even remotely better. So we're going to pick up some items here, and then we're also going to pick up a single equipment here. It's a very expensive equipment, but it's what we're going to be using later in the game. So the reason we're getting it is because it's an item that we would be getting late game anyway, but by picking it up now, we gain a very big power spike here, which is something we normally wouldn't have without picking up those 2 chests. So this troll here is, again, it likewise to the name, it's just a troll. It'll one-shot whatever unit it hits except for Vendor, but it has 75 health, which would be a one-shot for anybody in this party at that point. So this is going to be Yggdrasil. This is where the 3 hardest fights in the game are. So there's going to be a couple levels here. All of the enemies in here are crosses between 2 different animals. So there's 3 floors, and at the top will be a mini-boss and a boss. The boss of this tower is going to be the second time we actually have access to Tycho. And it'll be the second time we actually run into him. So this fight here, and along with most of the others, is just whittling down the enemies. There's a lot of resistances in this tower to some of the spells we've been using, but it's not too bad in the long run. Now, these Zebroids have a lot of health, but they're pretty weak to some of our abilities, so the fight's not too bad. They do also share a very similar name to the game developers. Here's the Void. I wonder if that was intentional. Who knows? It was intentional. I know. So unlike Penny Arcade 3, we don't really have a fight or an ability that gets stronger when there's less people in the fight. But we do just have attacks that are very strong overall. So these Monguins here are pretty weak. They're weak to fire. They're pretty much a one-shot to a Sky Bomb. Again, most of the fights are pretty simple in this game. There's not too much to talk about. The Mongwins themselves are pretty weak, but we will see them be pretty scary a little later on. So we are going to pick up another character very shortly. But again, we don't use them. There are very few characters that we actually acquire, that we pick up. Merch is a character we do get. The fight itself is pretty easy. But again, we don't really use him. All of the characters you pick up in the game are pretty interesting. They have a lot of very cool spells and abilities. But in terms of a speed run, it's not really something we care about. The interesting note about this fight is that once you beat the merch, the fight's over, so it doesn't matter about the other ones. So we weaken them a little bit and then sky bomb them. Or skydive them, rather. So right about now, all of the enemies in Yggdrasil are starting to get a lot of health, which means the fights are going on a little bit longer. But again, I'm strong enough that I can kill them before the 10% per round is relevant enough that it becomes scary. The only addendum to that is, again, the third floor, where every fight is scary. Yggdrasil is probably the most annoying part of the run. Not because it's hard, for the most part, but because all of the enemies have a lot of health, which is pretty uncommon up until this point of the run. You will also notice a very drastic power difference between this level or this chapter and the next chapter when we go back to Jim and Moira. So this fight here is a glimpse of what a very hard fight is. This fight is replicated on the third floor with an additional 2 units, which is the difference between an easy fight and a very, very scary fight. So the King Orion here has an AoE stun, which isn't really relevant when there's only 3 of them, and usually by the time the AoE stun goes off, 2 of them are dead. But on the 4th floor, they're joined by 2 other units, which have a lot of health, and an AoE stun and being slapped by 4 people, it gets very, very scary. So this fight here, if one of them is dead for too long, the other one will respawn it at full health. So what I'm doing here is I'm stacking the damage. Mr. Beaks is going to hit one of them, and everybody else is going to hit another. And we're basically just looking to get them down to very, very low healths. That way I can skydive one of them and get rid of them, and then have somebody else just one-shot them with either a fireball or a smother or anything else that'll end it. So right here, we're going to run up to a whale, a very friendly whale, which we'll see in a little bit. It's called a direwall. We'll see him again in a little bit. For a very, very brief second. But right now, it's not really important. We are coming on to the 3 hardest fights in the game. So the Mongwins aren't really an issue. The issue is the crystal dials at the back there. So they are resistant to pretty much every spell in my repertoire. And they also have a very, very, very high amount of health. So it takes a long time to get rid of them. And like I've said previously in this run, every round that goes through, the enemies get 10% stronger. So it is very, very scary here. This is one of the... I guess this is the first time this run I've called in Clutch a Claw. I used to call it in a lot more. So basically what Clutch a Claw does is every round it'll show up and it'll deal damage. So as you've noticed, I've already lost Grouchupon here. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to use Cauterize on Mr. Beak. So every round I'm also going to heal a little bit of damage on Mr. Beak. And then I'm going to have Vendor pick up Grouchupon. So the reason using Cauterize on Mr. Beak is worth losing the turn is at this point in the battle, I'm starting to take a lot of damage here. And I'm usually, once somebody gets hit, once somebody below about 100 health gets hit, they're usually dead. So at this point in the fight, Vendor is mostly just heal botting. The Cauterize on Mr. Beaks makes it very hard for Mr. Beaks to go down, plus somebody else. So if I take the time to Cauterize him, he stays pretty healthy. He does actually go down here, but it gives me a little bit of a time to heal everybody else up. As you can see here, this fight's going pretty poorly because everybody keeps going down. But I did have a heal queued up there. So even though Mr. Beak goes down, I still have 3 pretty healthy people. At this point, I switch to going, instead of healing, I go right for the crystal dial. The reason for that is because once I only have 1 up, as long as I have Vendor and somebody else alive, it's very hard for me to lose, especially with Clutch Claw up. So as long as Vendor and Gomez start healing, then it's pretty hard for me to lose this fight. So I do go through this fight here without wiping out. Wiping out in this game isn't too bad. You just have to redo the fight. But these fights are all very long. So this here, the Squidophant, it has an AoE attack that also heals all 3 of them. So basically what we're looking to do is we're looking to kill him as quickly as possible. Because he's just going to end up healing any of the damage we do. So we perforate him into the beginning, so all of his resistances are weakened, and then we're just going to hit him with everything we've got. We usually don't use too many people here, unless they all target the same person, which is very possible and very scary if it happens, because it's very hard to recover from that. But if we can get rid of the Squidophant before we lose 1 or 2 people, it's not too bad. We do run into the benefit here of having Hestia's ability for these fights. So Hestia, anybody who's linked to Hestia, once they're dead, they will revive with 1 HP. Which is nice for Gomez and Gratchapon because they're linked to Hestia. But for Mr. Beaks and Vendor, going down is final unless they're healed. So again, even though I got rid of the Squidophant, this fight is pretty hard because the Squidophant does a lot of damage. But this fight here is by far the hardest fight in the game. Like I was saying, it has... Or sorry, the 2 Mungwins are actually replaced in this fight by Pandux and Walders. So the Pandux and Walders are, aside from these fights, the hardest fights here because they do have so much health and they are resistant. So it takes a lot of damage to actually get rid of them. Combined with the AoE stun from the Kangarayan is very, very scary here. So what we do is, first thing we call in Clutch Claw, because Clutch Claw can start doing damage even while we're stunned, which is very important here, because if we get stun blocked, we still want to be able to have Clutch Claw doing some damage. It's very rare that we get completely stun locked, but it is very important in the chance that it does happen, because getting stun locked is pretty unfixable. The added benefit of using Clutch Claw first is the first attack that anybody linked to Gabe does is going to deal more damage. Now, because we called in Clutch Claw right away, it actually, every single time Clutch Claw comes in, it's going to have the added damage from the Gabe passive, which is why anytime you use Clutch Claw, you use it first turn. Once everybody else in the Kangarayan fight's gone, it's a pretty safe fight, especially if everybody's alive, or at least 2 or 3 people. So those are the 3 hardest fights in the game. I was able to go through them without wiping, which is very good. It's not often that you do wipe, but it is very, very possible to wipe if you aren't careful. And all the other fights in the game, if you aren't careful, it's still pretty difficult to wipe, but those 3 fights there are the easiest to wipe, and they're some of the most pricey, risky resets because the fights are so long. So right here, this is the sub-boss, the fake boss. We are strong to magic, weak to physical, so we just have pretty much Mr. Beaks take him out. This here, however, is strong to physical and weak to magic. So we do have Tycho here. So Tycho's going to use a spell called Pontifex, which buffs everybody's magic, and then everybody's just going to use magic spells. Mr. Beaks used Perforate, and Mr. Beaks here is pretty low. He's on a near death, but it doesn't actually matter because he doesn't do that much damage in this fight. Plus, I'm losing a lot of damage by reviving him as opposed to just letting him die, so it doesn't matter too much here. I do lose a little bit of time from the sub-boss and one of the other fights, but it's not too much time waste. So right here, we're going to hit a shop and we're going to pick up some items for this party. Again, they are very weak, so they need everything they can get. Catsby, we are going to be using later on. Or sorry, Twisp we're going to be using later on, so we want to max Twisp out here. And we're going to put an item on Catsby here, which makes him deal a lot of damage, because he is going to be one of the two that's going to carry this fight here. We do pick up a very expensive item we're going to put on Catsby now. The reason we're doing it now is he's going to use it through the rest of this split, and then once we get to the final buy, we're actually going to take him off him. Otherwise, we won't have enough for our final 4. But fortunately, we can buy it now and make this split a little easier. So now, on Jim and Moore, we're running through a battle zone between Tychos and some robots. So all of the Tychos here are going to tone hostile on us, because they're just very, very unkind people. Very similar to Tycho in lots of ways. So if you remember the damage and the health from Gabe and Hestia's group, you come back here and we're very, very weak, where Mr. Beast was doing an average of 2,000 damage per attack. Most of our guys are doing an average of 200 per attack, and all of the healths are very drastically reduced. Again, because we haven't been using them very much, but... So we're going to run through this split for a little bit, and then at the end of this split here, we're actually going to pick up Tycho, and Tycho carries this very, 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 very hard. Tycho is very strong whenever you run into him. He has an ability which does AoE damage for free. He has AoE ice abilities, and he has abilities that buff his party as well as give him mana per turn. So he is very, very strong. And then we've got these guys here, which are very weak. They actually do have this split here is very hard for them, because they are very weak compared to the enemies that they run into. In a casual, it's not too bad because you pick up some items and stuff, and take your time to buff everybody. Buy some items for everybody. But we need to conserve our money, because the game isn't meant to fight as little battles as possible and pick up as little as possible. So the money at the end is very, very tight. You're just barely able to buff everybody you need to for the final chapter. So we're not able to spend any extra money at this point to buff anybody, more than we already have. In a casual playthrough, we would have equipped them with all kinds of accessories and bought everybody weapons and everything, but we don't really have the luxury to do that in a speedrun. So this fight here is very hard because the zombie at the back there, or not the zombie, but the giant at the back there, is very strong. He's resistant to pretty much everything you want to throw at him. But he's not as hard as compared to some other fights we're going to run into very shortly. So we basically clear everybody out, and then we use some spells. Fortunately, he's weak to the spells, so... Here I use Rat Fever, which adds poison. Something I should have added a little earlier, but... So this fight here is actually pretty difficult. So every time a unit dies, I'm going to take some damage here. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to use Let's Positive Thinking, which is the only time I would ever use this spell in the game. And basically what's that's going to do is the weakest person every round is going to get a little bit of a heal. So that's going to help me out because it's going to reduce the amount of healing I need to do from taking damage from all of these guys. Because I eliminate all of them very quickly, and I take a lot of damage because of it. So I don't really have the luxury of healing anybody because I can't predict who's going to get hurt. Typically, if Broden gets hurt, I leave him because Broden does nothing this fight or any fights for a little while. So if Broden goes down, that's fine. If somebody goes down, Broden's going to waste his turn to heal them. So Catsby here goes down. Which isn't that uncommon in this fight. Flossify also goes down, but it's more important to get Catsby up. A, because he went down first, and B, because he has mana. And so now we get Tycho here. Tycho, fortunately, replaces Brodent in my party, which is what I want because Brodent is useless. And here we see just how strong Tycho is. He's able to pretty much one-shot the first couple of fights. After that, they're going to start to get a little bit more health. But Tycho and Catsby here do a lot of work in clearing out most of the enemies here. So here I misplayed a little bit. I should have attacked instead of using Soul Eater, but it's not too bad. It doesn't waste too much time. So these guys have been at war with the Brahis for a while. And now we're going to run into Team Rocket for a second time. This fight goes by a lot quicker. We're a lot stronger this time around. Also, we've got Tycho, and Tycho is a god. So this story here, the story of the game is basically following. It's a story written by Tycho himself. It's a pretty interesting story. Basically, and this is going to be, we're going to run into this a little later on, but basically, the plot of the games are Tycho's hidden intentions, which you find out a little bit about. You find out more towards the end. But there's 8 gods, and you need to kill all of them. Tycho tricks you into killing the first one. Some of them fight each other and die. But there's 8 gods which need to die before the world is recreated. Tycho wants to destroy the world so that he can start over a new world, which isn't based on hatred and evil. He wants to base it off of goodness and purity. So it's actually in the cutscene at the beginning of the game we skipped. But basically, he hid his niece in a place just outside of reality, so that when the world is destroyed, the new world would be based off of his niece instead. So he's tricked you into killing most of them, and it actually turns out at the end of the game that Tycho is the other god. He is the 8th and final god, which is in part why Tycho is so strong, because he's a god. So in this area, Catsby and Tycho are pretty much able to one-shot everybody. Both of them have ice abilities. Tycho has a 0 mana AoE that does a lot of damage, so he's able to use that and then Blizzard, or Blizzard and then that. So we get 3 AoE abilities right after each other, which is very strong. Fortunately for us as well, everything in here is weak to ice for the most part. So we do get a lot of damage off of the double blizzards. As well, Tycho starts off with an mana each turn, and Catsby does as well, so they're both able to use Blizzard right away, which is nice. So these 2 Aerocrafts here are actually pretty strong. They have a lot of health, and they do take a little bit of damage to get rid of. But fortunately, they don't really stand a chance of wiping anybody, so that's not something we really run into too often. But we do basically just hit them with... we hit them with 2 Blizzards at first, and then we just hit them with pretty much single targets, because it's a lot easier to deal damage quickly like that. Just the way the stacking works out, it works out in our favor. The damage stacking, that is. The mech Troyosas at the back are pretty strong. So it does take a couple of hits to get rid of them. And right here, I actually misplayed a little bit. I had Catsby attack instead of doing something else. So they would have been dead a little sooner here. But it's not too important. We lose a little bit of time, but he was the next one to go anyway, so the turn, not that much time was wasted. So this fight here does go on a little bit longer because everybody here has a lot of health. So we're gonna Jesus. We're gonna get rid of the mech Triosa at the back first, and then we're gonna deal with the tall boys. The tall boys here are resistant to most of the attacks we want to use. I just had Tycho use Hug Everybody, it looks like, which was a misclick. So this is really the first part where all characters would stray from the any percent. We would have gotten one character so far. We actually ran by him in the last split. It was one square off of the intended path, which is the first one we would have gotten. That red portal we just saw would have been the second character. That's Ninja Z, and he's actually the fastest character in the game. The amount of time it takes to get him doesn't actually balance out how much he saves in the any percent, so we don't get him. But in the all characters run where we have to get him anyway, he does save a lot of time. And he actually makes the hardest boss in the game possible. So we're nearing the end of this area here. And at the right before the final boss, we're actually going to lose control of Gabe. Or not Gabe, sorry, Tycho. He's going to leave us for the final fight. Which isn't too bad, because the final boss isn't actually that difficult. The final boss in this area is manageable. It's a little bit difficult because you get Brodent back instead of Tycho, and Tycho does a lot of work here. But it's actually not too bad. And then once we finish this area here, once we beat the Necromancer, we actually go to the final area of the game. So basically what this game has is it has a pretty extensive map. You're not really able to get to most of the areas early on because they're blocked by obstacles or something. But we're actually right after the Necromancer. That dire whale we saw earlier is going to show up, and the dire whale is actually our airship of the game, and we get free roam of the map basically. So this fight here is scary because these actually do a lot of damage. So if we don't have a significant amount of them done by round 2 or 3, then it is actually very scary. However, if we just have everybody defend and Catsby and Tycho do some stuff, AoE stuff, then it's not too bad. Again, I defended here on Catsby when I shouldn't have, but it didn't matter too much because everybody was defending. Not too many extra turns went off. Extra turns in here don't waste too much time compared to 3 because we do have that speed up. So right here we're losing Tycho, and we're going to fight the Mechamancer. Again, the Mechamancer's not that hard. You do actually just get thrown right into the fight. But again, it's not that difficult. It's only one enemy. He has a lot of health. A lot of health, but nothing really to be scared of. We do spend a little bit of time waiting this round. Because using our 2-mana abilities is faster than just waiting and auto-attacking. And since there's only one guy, we're not going to take too much damage, so it's not risky. So now we have our dire whale, our airship, and we have free roll of the map. So instead of going anywhere, we're just going straight to the final area. So we're going to have a little bit of a shopping menu here. Basically, we're going to buy the most expensive and strongest accessories, and then we're going to equip everybody in our party with everything we need. So that was a little bit of a slow menu, but I was getting rid of the Hark Signet that was on Catsby and giving it to, getting it so I can give it to somebody else. Now, even though Twisp and Catsby do buff each other up if they're in the same area. Ooh, misclick, I put a magic ring on him instead of a Hark Signet. So even though Catsby and Twisp do buff each other up, it is very, very difficult to put in Catsby into this because Gomez and Grouchpon deal so much damage, and I can't replace... Mr. Beaks does the most damage, especially in the final fight, so I can't get rid of either of those three. So I'd really just replace Twisp with Catsby, which isn't really beneficial. So I do lose out on the passive between those two there, but it's not too important. So these fights here are pretty easy. We are going to run into a fight where we gain extra MP per turn, so we can just hit them with our strongest abilities every single turn. We actually call clutch or perforate this guy here. So if his defenses go down, because he does have pretty high defenses. So now we can just slap him with all of our strong abilities, and we get rid of him pretty quickly. So this next area here is one of the best dungeons I've seen in terms of design in any game. I really do like the design that the developers have here. So we don't get to see it for a little bit, but we do have some pretty difficult enemies here. And a lot of the design of this dungeon we're not really going to get to see, but there is one part which we do fortunately get to showcase. These first fights are a little easy. There are some annoying fights in a couple seconds here. These ones are pretty much just deal some AoE damage and win. We are, however, going to run into some enemies that are going to start hitting us and taking away some MP, which makes it very risky to use abilities, or not use abilities that take 1 mana. Because if you look here, they did damage based on my MP, and I lost the MP. So using moves like like Skydive, Smother is pretty risky, because it takes a turn to actually build that up. Plus, if you lose the MP before the attack goes off, you basically waste your turn. Although, once you start getting rid of some of them, then the fights become safer to do. So these here are going to be the opposite of what I ran into in the last, so I'm not able to AoE kill them as easy, because I don't have an AoE spell that gets rid of them as easy. So instead I just had to go with the good old slapping them for lots of damage strat. This fight here, again, it's not too hard, just time consuming. Lots of resistances against what I normally use, but I still do a lot of damage anyway, so it's not too bad. Skydive, fortunately, does a lot of damage no matter what, so I'm able to one-shot one of them every 2 turns, or every 2 turns. So again, this is another fight where people do damage based on my MP. So I'm looking to get rid of one of them. Once I've gotten rid of one of them, it becomes a lot safer to use my abilities. And I think I actually just go for it anyway. It is risky, but if you can use your abilities without getting your MP taken, then it is very worth it. And this here is my favorite, or part of my favorite design. So there's a chest here, and it makes it look like you don't really want to go there, because mostly throughout the game, chests have been put in corners. So they make the design of that area with the chest there, make it seem like that's not the intended way to go, even though it is. So right here, we're going to run into some bosses we would have fought throughout the run here. Not only this run, but some previous runs. They've got some funny names, but they are similar to enemies we have fought in either this game or previous games. These guys here have some AoE heals, which is pretty obnoxious. So we're going to call out Clutch Claw pretty much immediately. And then we're just going to slap them again with our biggest moves. We can get rid of a lot of them pretty quickly like this. Again, Dive Bomb does a ridiculous amount of damage here. It's so incredibly strong. I actually did waste a little bit of damage there, but some of my guys are getting pretty weak. This fight was a little poor, but didn't waste too much time. So now we're actually inside the body of God. So we've got a couple of our fights we need to fight first before we can actually fight the final boss. So we've got the spleen, the heart, and the brain, along with other disgusting parts of this God's body. A lot of these things are pretty weak to some of my spells, so it's pretty straightforward here. I used an AoE ability, which pretty much lets me one-shot all of these guys with abilities. There's not very many fights here between the bosses, as long as you follow the correct pathing. These fights here are pretty easy because everybody's pretty weak to either Gomez or Gachapon. So one of them will have an ability which does a lot of damage. And as always, Dive Bomb just does an incredible amount of damage. I call it Dive Bomb even though it's Skydive right now. But Skydive, Dive Bomb, it does a lot of damage. Or sorry, it is Dive Bomb now. It starts off as Skydive, then it turns to Dive Bomb. So right here we're going to run up on the first boss, which is the spleen. The spleen's not too much of a difficult boss. The spleen is very straightforward. Just hit it. That's pretty much it. Perforate it to reduce his his defenses, and then just slap it with your biggest stuff. It's not too hard to do. There's not a huge chance of wiping here, even though some of my guys are pretty weak. His damage isn't that great, so he would have to do a lot more damage than he really has. Plus, two of my guys here are equipped to Hestia, so they're going to revive with 1 HP. Healing in that area isn't really an issue. So now we're starting to run into some things that are stronger. Those God's Bloods, like the last fight, or sorry, like a fight coming up, they're going to heal, so we want to just get rid of the 2 White Bloods quickly as possible, because pretty much any of the damage we do is going to be negated. Fortunately, for our very strong attacks, the damage isn't going to be negated, so a Dive Bomb or a Flame Spear gets through and still does a lot of damage. But it is still best to get rid of the White's Bloods before anything else. So we go ahead and get rid of the God's Bloods. Once the White's Bloods are gone, the God's Bloods don't do too much. These guys have a large amount of health, but they're not that scary. Again, it just takes time to get rid of them. Fortunately, a single power-up dive bomb would get rid of one of them, and then everybody else is able to just slap the other guy around. And at this point, we're pretty buffed up that not too much is going to be problems for us. We're going to run into a second area here. We're actually running into the heart, sorry. So right here, what we want to do is we want to get rid of one of the God's Bloods. And then we want to also perforate the heart. And so we're going to get rid of one of the God's Bloods. Because 2 God's Bloods pretty much negates 50% of our damage. If we kill both of them, then the heart's just going to respawn 2 more God's Bloods. So we want to get rid of one of them. And then we want to dish out as much damage as possible on the heart. Because otherwise, the God's Bloods heal for approximately 3,200 Or sorry, not 3,200, 4,800 across all three of them. This one would only heal for about 8,000, or 800. It's 8,000. So I'm able to get a lot more significant damage on the heart, especially since both of them power up per turn. They'd be able to one-shot us very easily if I hadn't taken out the other God's Bloods. So even though I do lose Mr. Beaks here, I can just keep doing what I'm doing because everybody else at this point has the damage. Looks like I do go for a potion here. And I end up just losing him anyway. I would have been better off just going for him. I do pick up Grouchapon though, which is good. So I lose a little bit of time off my best here, but I still save a bit of time on this split. So now we're going for the brain. The brain is the hardest of the three organs, but still not the hardest of the final area. Again, the final boss here is the most difficult. So again, these guys just have a lot of health. They're very easy to get rid of, but it takes a couple of turns to get rid of them. Even though they do power up a little bit, they don't really pose any threat here. They're merely obstacles between us and the final boss, which is actually Tycho. Fortunately for us though, Tycho is kind enough to help us kill his brain before we actually fight him. So we will have Tycho for the final boss, which makes the final boss very, very easy. Again, with the AoE damage, the Pontifex, the Mana Spigot, all that stuff helps out a lot. This guy here is very, it has a lot of health, but that's pretty much it. This here is a mix between a Deep Crow, which is what Mr. Beaks is, and a Scarecrow. So in theory it should be doing a lot of damage, which it does one-shot Mr. Beaks, but it's not that strong, so we get rid of it pretty easily. So we're using AoE spells here on Grouchapon and Twist to deal as much AoE damage as possible. Then we can usually just use some 1 or 2 mana spells and get rid of them pretty easily. Powered up Dive Bomb is still able to get rid of the highest minion after a double autos, which is good. And so now we're going to run into the last 2 fights of the game. So this first one here is going to be the Brain. The Brain is pretty straightforward. It's not the easiest fight in the game. It's very difficult for you to wipe, though. So first off, we have Tycho use Mana Stream, so he's going to get 2 mana every turn. So basically, he's going to be able to use Ice Shard every single turn. We Perforate, and then we have Pontifex Cask, so everybody's magic is going to go up. And then after that, we're just going to have Tycho Ice Shard. We call out Clutch a Claw to do some AoE damage. Then we're going to use their strongest attacks. Again, so this is a fight where the Brain will do damage based on your MP. That's only really important for Mr. Beaks and Tycho. So here I'll lose Grouchapon here. So I do take the time to revive him because it still is a little scary, even though it's not incredibly likely that we wipe. I still want as much damage up as possible, because once I start to lose 2 people, then it gets very bad. But this fight goes pretty easy. And so now we're on to the final fight of the game. So we do have to do a quick party change. Because we switched to Tycho, our party is a little messed up here. So we're going to quickly pull out our full team here, and then we're going to go against Tycho, Meritus, Barahi. So fortunately, everybody has a ability to the Scholar class, which is what Tycho had. So everybody has the access to Hug Everybody, Pontifex, and Mana Stream. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to use a Mana Stream on everybody so that everybody's getting 2 MP per turn. This is especially important on Mr. Beaks, who's going to be the biggest damage this turn. So I do misplay a little bit here. I should have pulled out Gelatinous Cube on Gomez. Actually, I attacked, so no, I didn't misplay. Gelatinous Cube comes up next turn. So I do need to be doing Basically, what I'm doing here is, besides struggling to find Gelatinous Cube, I have Twisp and or Gratchapon or Gomez, depending on who's low at what turn. Two of the three are going to be casting Hug Everybody, which is an AoE heal. The other two are just going to be dealing damage. I have Twisp here just healing regardless, because it is possible to lose one or two people here, which is a little scary. And then I have Mr. Beaks just doing some auto attacks. Basically what he's looking to do here is on his 8th turn, or when he has 8 men, he's going to power up, and he's going to use an ability called Pulverize, which is the ultimate move, which does a ridiculous amount of damage. So if I had been dealing damage as I should have been here, instead of healing as pretty much every chance, he'd be dead. I spent a little too much time healing, so he does live a little bit. Fortunately, he doesn't live with much. I only wasted 1 or 2, so he does go down to a dive bomb right after. And this is the fastest I've done this game or anybody else. This is Penny Arcade 4 on the Rain Slick Precipice of Darkness. That is my VOD, so I'm just going to go ahead and close that. Actually, we're just going to go pause on this screen. Oh, whatever. We're just going to pause this. So this is a different video. We're not going to worry about that. But that was Penny Arcade's 4 on the Rain Slick Precipice of Darkness, any percent. Pretty similar to the all categories. I'll probably do an all categories run through as well, even though there's not too much to talk about that's different. But besides that, that's my Penny Arcade 4. Thanks for watching.